Hi there, I'm Tom Field. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group, and I want to welcome you to today's session entitled Financial Institutions Seek a Step-In Approach to Sensitive, Unstructured Data Compliance and Security. Your featured presenters today are Deborah Kish. She's Executive Vice President, Marketing and Research with Fasoo, and she's joined by Joe Krull. He's a Senior Analyst, Cybersecurity with AITE Group. Now, before I turn this over to the two of them, let me give you a little bit of background on what they're going to talk about. New privacy regulations uncover undermanaged, unstructured data that expands the risk to the organization. Companies are beginning to understand that compliance and security challenges surrounding sensitive data must be prioritized, and they're seeking cost-effective approaches to address the full life cycle of sensitive file needs. In particular, data discovery, classification, data mapping, compliance, and protection. In this session today, Deborah and Joe are going to discuss how financial services institutions are seeking step-in products to help them achieve data security and compliance. This webinar summarizes AITE's recently published Impact Report, Sensitive Data Everywhere, Find It, Manage It, and Protect It, which highlights a common use case in a large financial services institution and how a step-in strategy enabled by Fasoo's data security and compliance platform has met the combined challenge. I want to take just a moment to tell you about my organization, Information Security Media Group. We are a global education and intelligence firm. You might know us best by one of our 30-plus international media sites. These include Bank Info Security, Gov Info Security, and Healthcare Info Security, as well as 3 sites we've launched just this year, dedicated to device security, payment security, and fraud. Each one of our sites is dedicated to providing education and news regarding information security, but specifically tailored to their individual sectors. With over 950,000 members registered to our sites, we've created a true information source that tackles the key issues of interest to our unique audience. Just a few notes of housekeeping. If you have any questions for Joseph or for Deborah during the course of this session, you can submit them anytime via the chat windows that you see on your screen. If any of you should experience technical issues while viewing today's webinar, please dial the number you see on your screen now. If you dial extension 115, we do have technical support staff standing by to help. Also, I do need to emphasize the content being presented today is copyrighted material. It's meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you or your organization would like to use any of the information presented today, or if you're looking for customized training materials, please contact us. It's my pleasure to introduce our sponsor, Fasoo. Fasoo provides unstructured data security, privacy, and enterprise content platforms that protect, control, trace, analyze, and share critical business information securely while enhancing productivity. Fasoo's continuous focus on customer innovation and creativity provide market-leading solutions to the challenges faced by organizations of all sizes and sectors. Fasoo's vision is to empower organizations with platform technologies to achieve successful digital transformation and superior data security. To exceed customers' expectation throughout the digital journey, Fasoo is dedicated to deliver exceptional value through software and services all around the world. Fasoo has a relentless focus on innovation and creativity and will continue to provide solutions to the challenges faced by organizations, again, of all sizes and sectors. To learn more, please visit fasoo.com. Now, quickly, let's meet our speakers today. Again, Deborah Kish is EVP of Marketing and Research at Fasoo. She's responsible for leading Fasoo's research, marketing, and product strategies in the unstructured data security and privacy space. She brings more than 20 years of experience in research with her prior employer, Gartner, where she worked in the technology and service provider security team, responsible for tracking data security technologies and advising thousands of end user and vendor clients. Joe Krull, again, is a senior analyst at AITE Group. He specializes in cybersecurity, privacy, and IT risk. He splits his time between San Antonio, Texas, and Tel Aviv, Israel, and he brings more than 40 years of security and privacy experience to AITE Group. He's a frequent speaker at international cyber and privacy events and has been a regular contributor to cyber and audit professional organizations in the US and Europe. He's worked in 115 countries and has provided cyber and privacy consulting advice to large enterprises on 4 continents. With that, let's meet Joe Krull and Deborah Kish. Folks, the stage is set for you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, we recently completed some research around unstructured data security. And I'm going to run through some of the things we learned during this research and some of the things that are contained in our recently released report. So we were very concerned about what organizations were really doing around unstructured data. It's out there, and just so everybody has a understanding of what we mean by unstructured data, we're not talking about data in traditional data stores and databases. We're talking primarily about things like Office files, like Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoints, Microsoft Word documents, and extracts and derivatives of those documents. That's the unstructured data, and we produce this every day as part of normal business operations. So as we dove deep into unstructured data security research, we did interviews with 10 privacy technology companies, and we spoke with leaders at 5 financial services companies to get their aspects and understand their points of view regarding what they're doing to protect unstructured data. As I said, we've just released this report. It has a market overview and a case study, and I'll run through those on the next few slides. So what do we mean by unstructured data? We really don't have a way to effectively apply very, very granular controls to these types of files which are being created. Text files or spreadsheets or presentations, and they're scattered everywhere within the organization, and they're being created every minute of every day. And we have found that very little effort is really set aside or devoted to managing this data, and even less to really protecting it. But what's happened recently is that major privacy mandates, such as the European GDPR, have really forced us to really look at what type of data are we managing, what type of data are we creating, and how is this data propagating within the organization so we can achieve privacy compliance. And this is beyond GDPR. There are other regulatory requirements that require us to watch data, to manage data, and protect data as well. But it's really been GDPR and the privacy mandates which have really kicked off some of this interesting development that I'm going to talk about. So the first market trend, let me say that we've always had data governance tools. They've been around for a long time. And organizations have used these tools to affect data quality, to do policy enforcement, and in some cases to try to unlock value in the data that resides in their organization. So this has been around a while, and it's a fairly mature category of products and tools. And then in about 2017, we really saw a lot of privacy compliance tools come into the market to overlap these data governance tools. And then if you take the security piece, the cyber defense tools like data loss prevention, you layer those over the top, you've really got a really interesting convergence now between these tools to not only manage data, but to classify it, to control it. And what's really interesting about this is it's going to bring new strategies to an organization to kind of go beyond compliance, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So some of these data discovery and classification tools actually allow you to protect the sensitive data. You can pinpoint where the most sensitive data is. You can apply encryption, or you can put unique tags at the file level. And what's really exciting about this, the implication in our opinion, is you now have tools that allow chief information security officers, data privacy officers, and data governance specialists to actually sit at the table and use these tools to each meet their own objectives. and really go beyond just simple management of the data, but really to implement very specific data protection for the most sensitive data. The next thing we saw is that organizations can really use these as enablers. Instead of protecting everything in the organization, with the same level of controls, now you can go in and you can identify your most sensitive data. Examples being, privacy data, as I mentioned. It could be data that is regulated, such as PCI data, if you're processing credit cards. You can now pinpoint this data, apply controls to it, and then apply different types of protection. Most interesting would be the encryption. So instead of protecting everything with the same level of protection, you can now be much more granular in your approach. And finally, we still do not have a national data privacy law. We've got a patchwork of laws across the United States. We've got GDPR, as I previously mentioned. You have a new privacy law in Brazil, and you have many other sectoral and industry-related rules for protecting data. And because we don't have this, we don't have one common law, it really makes privacy compliance very, very difficult. And anything that makes that privacy compliance simpler should be of interest to not only the security team, the privacy team, but also that data governance team as well, because now you have the ability to use these tools to meet these three objectives and avoid both compliance and cybersecurity risk. So let me just give you an example of how data proliferates. So there's Dan over there on the left-hand side, and he's responsible for pricing. And once a month, he prepares a spreadsheet, which is a very complex spreadsheet that contains the pricing for all of the raw components or all of the tools that are being used by an organization, all the vendor relationships. Then that spreadsheet also has profit margins. It has all different kinds of data that allow the business to be successful. And once a month, Dan sends that spreadsheet out to 6 of his colleagues for them to review, update, make changes, which will result in a consolidated, updated spreadsheet. But generally, that goes through a couple of different rounds of reviews. And in this particular case, rather than using a collaboration tool like a SharePoint or a Box, they have elected, because it's easier, to just do this via emailing the spreadsheet around. And through a couple of rounds of reviews, you now have 27 versions of this spreadsheet in different forms located on the hard drives of the desktops and laptops, and on the servers and in file shares, and it just keeps proliferating. And generally, people don't go back and delete those versions. They just kind of reside and they keep chugging along forever. So data really proliferates very quickly. And this is just an example of pricing, but it could also be customer data. It could also be information related to strategy. It could be M&A data, which is extremely sensitive, but the data is proliferating. So some other things we found during our research is that data retention policies are really difficult to enforce. It's real easy to create data, but people are reluctant to go back and destroy the data that they've created. Human nature is, I worked so hard on this particular report or the spreadsheet, and I really don't want to destroy it. I may need it again for a future project, or it's easier for me just to go back and update this the next time I need to do it. So people are not good about destroying the data that they've prepared or created. And what we also find is that people inadvertently move data to areas where it's outside of the normal auditing, logging, and monitoring. An example would be somebody working with credit card data, although there's a defined PCI zone within the organization for storing the data, it's pretty easy to get distracted, and particularly now in a work from home environment, to inadvertently store that data outside of the enclave of PCI protection. We also see that data classification, if you don't stay on top of it and you don't really manage it well, it really makes those data loss prevention tools less effective. We're seeing now, in the course of this research, tools that you can use to scan, you can do classification, you can do compliance reporting, and you can actually take action on that data. And we were really excited when we saw this new category of tools. And we saw the ability to do classifications using a couple of different methods, whether it's on a template or a customizable policy that can be defined by the organization. We saw a wide range of deployment options, whether it's a SaaS solution or on-prem, on-device implementation, which really gives a lot of flexibility to organizations if they want to manage unstructured data. And as the case is with most cybersecurity tools today, we did see the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to really boost the capability of the tools. So we were very, very interested and excited by seeing this during our research. So compliance obviously is a big driver, and some of you may have noticed that in October in the UK, British Airways got a 20 million British pound fine for a data breach that happened in 2018. 20 million is a pretty substantial fine, but it's only one of 400 GDPR fines which have been acknowledged. There are others that still have not seen the light of day. So GDPR is now starting to impact a lot of organizations, not just in Europe, but globally. And what this does is it means that organizations are getting very serious about data privacy compliance. And they're looking for any kind of tools that will help them meet that compliance. But the product development around privacy has kind of had this additional impact where you can not only identify data that is bound by GDPR or other privacy rules, but you can now pull it out of unstructured data and apply some protection controls to it. Another interesting thing is if you've got multiple copies of the data, you can start to manage that and reduce the redundancy if you don't need multiple copies. And as we said, these products, the ones that are really enhanced, you can go beyond the discovery and classification and then start to really protect the data. And we've seen tools with file level encryption, unique document codes, and really the ability to use this for fine-grained data loss prevention, whether that's within the tool itself or using your existing DLP solution to just make it a better solution. So I wanted to kind of see how this was being done. And so I had an opportunity to speak with the Chief Information Security Officer at a very large global bank. They have more than 40,000 employees. And I asked him, I said, well, what was the problem that you were trying to solve? And he said, well, I always knew that I had lots of unstructured data. And I always kind of took a faith-based approach to that. I was going to apply controls anywhere I possibly could within reason and within my resources and budget to try to reduce this risk. But I really never felt comfortable, he told me, because I was kind of protecting everything and I didn't have a very targeted approach to that. And he told me specifically that his pain points were around documents on the local workstation and on these network drives. So that was where his pain point was, and he was looking for a solution to do that. He looked at a lot of different tools and a lot of different solutions, but some of those were extremely costly, some of which were really not applicable to what he was trying to do. And he was introduced to Fasoo's Data Radar product, and it allowed him to take a step-in approach. And by step-in, he was able to start to manage the security of unstructured data without having to make a significant investment like he would have had he gone for a full-blown data privacy or a data governance tool or something similar to that. So it was a quick way to get something going within the bank and proved the capability and demonstrated to leadership and the bank's board as a way that they could have more than just a faith-based approach to protecting this data. So he implemented Fasoo Data Radar. He did it on the North American infrastructure. Took him about 6 months to do it, but he said, frankly, he could have done it in half the time. But since it was a new capability, he wanted to do it in a very systematic way and make sure everyone was comfortable with it. And he told me he really didn't have any issues or problems with the deployment. He got about 3 hours of training for the staff, and they felt comfortable that they could use the tool. And what he did was, after a very quick iteration with this Fasoo Data Radar product, he went to the more advanced Fasoo product, which is called the Enterprise DRM, or FED. And he's now deployed both Data Radar and FED to the bank's global infrastructure. And you'll hear in a few minutes a little bit more about the approach for using this. And I'll just move you down to the last part of that slide, where you have a couple of comments that were specific from the CISO, such as he knows where it's at and they're no longer blind. And he expressed great confidence in working with the Fasoo team. And I thought that was a very interesting endorsement for this approach. So as a course of our research, our interviews, studying the market, and by the way, we now believe that the data privacy convergence is about $1 billion market a year, and it's going to continue to grow. But the recommendations that we have for organizations that are concerned about unstructured data is they should look at that as part of their cybersecurity strategy. What's the risk appetite? Do they really want to or need to protect unstructured data? And that's where it starts. So it's a review process, and the good news is if you do decide you want to do that, you do have technologies and tools today to affect that protection. So if you're an organization and you're thinking about using privacy compliance, we would say look beyond that and look at some of these newer tools that allow you to actually do file-level data protection. So beyond just privacy compliance and data governance. And finally, our last recommendation is if your budget for this, for privacy technologies and unstructured data isn't yet defined, you might want to consider a similar step-in approach as was the case with the bank that I mentioned in the case study. Because that might be a way to quickly get in there, show the viability, show the value, and then to build upon that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah from Fasoo to tell you more about their solutions.
Cool, thanks, Joe. And you know, I'm happy to say on behalf of Fasoo, from myself and on behalf of Fasoo, we really appreciate you joining me here. So thanks again. So as you heard Joe mention, you know, trends right now show a new focus on unstructured data protection that traditional data governance tools have not generally been used by CISOs and data privacy officers for unstructured data. And here's why. So many have invested in data loss prevention, full-blown enterprise data loss prevention. And if we sort of put DLP out on the table and examine it, you'll note that, you know, while it does what it should be doing, which is blocking and alerting, but the extent of blocking and alerting leads to loss of productivity and ultimately alert fatigue. But more importantly, it's not protecting the data itself. And not to mention, you know, the overall expense of DLP. Joe mentioned step-in approaches and being, you know, more budget friendly, for lack of a better term. So many of you, if you were to put DLP on the table right now, you might be finding yourselves having ultimately the same conversations that are, you know, going on at this very table. And I'm not trying to be cute or anything, but, you know, this is ultimately what, you know, how we look at DLP if we were to, again, put it on the table. So let me introduce Fasoo's data security and privacy framework, which is essentially a file-centric approach. So as Joe mentioned, Fasoo Data Radar through the case study, which is our discovery and classification tool, but it goes beyond just discovery and classification. It encrypts files for security, and it attaches an embedded ID that actually sticks to the document and any derivative. Our sales guy likes to call it file GPS, which I think is kind of funny. But it actually sticks to that file and any derivative of that document or file wherever it goes. So this is for better tracing. So you have both security and tracing. The embedded ID also gives you visibility into each file so you can track it and see when the last time a user accessed it, and you could make decisions about what happens. For example, if you're doing a data cleanup exercise, you might want to archive or delete. To Joe's point, a lot of us are not particularly good at deleting or destroying copies of files. So if you're in a data minimization or management of data, this is a good way to do that. And you can add Fasoo DRM. We refer to it as FED, granular permissions, as the entire platform for even stronger protection, making sure that the most highly sensitive information is accessed by only authorized users. So one of the many areas that is a challenge, there are many, but one of the areas is governance of the data. So with traditional tools like user behavior analytics and DLP, they're really tied to specific locations. So if you have some documents in the cloud, you'll use a CASB. You might have other tools. I already mentioned DLP, but you might have other data-centric audit and protection tools like user behavior analytics that will monitor movement of information. And through all of that, you have a disparate set of logs and systems that you'd have to go into. You'd have device logs, network logs, and application logs. And to reconcile and correlate that information is almost impossible. So what I mean by that is, in order to change policy, you would have to identify all of those systems and evaluate the policies and actions across each of them. And then whether that's classification, access controls or encryption, and make changes across that broad set of tools, which is really destined for errors. So with the Fasoo platform, we have a more centralized view of policies, which means that you have a single source or one place to go if you need to show or prove compliance with a regulator, or if you have to report on information, or if you have to make changes to policy. To go through all those other systems would not only be time consuming, but the level of accuracy will probably be marginal. And it's important to simplify these processes as much as possible. And you can do that. We hear a lot about, AI, ML, and automation. So you can simplify a lot of things through automation. So for starters, automation will allow you to take away decision-making from people. I mean, we're all humans. We all make mistakes. One of the more popular ways of accidentally leaking information is through email, for example, because it's the most common way to leak information. Sending a sensitive file to the wrong person. And unfortunately, that could lead to a lot of problems and, potential legal ramifications, loss of business, or, maybe even loss of your competitive advantage. So if you automate the process of discovery and you find information that's sensitive and then classify it or tag it as appropriate, if it's sensitive, you might want to automatically encrypt it. And then you can apply access controls through, like I said, our Fasoo data DRM, and that can change, access control can change dynamically because of the centralized policies I just talked about. So for example, if somebody leaves the company or changes responsibilities, access can be revoked very easily. Now I mentioned part of the encryption process The platform embeds the unique identifier to each file. So if a single file turns into multiple files, you know, like Joe talked about with the Excel sheet with the sensitive pricing information, those derivatives can easily be tracked and the protection stays with them. So each file is protected as if it were the original file. And all that gets picked up in our comprehensive logging, which is really core for security and privacy so that you can easily respond to audits. So for years now, data security has been a moving target with how a lot of companies have actually tried to tackle it. And mainly the focus was on structured databases. But I'm talking more about the unstructured data, like the Microsoft Office documents and PDFs and things of that nature. So enterprise DLP can do things like discover and classify, but they're limited and they don't protect the data itself. And there are a lot of niche solution vendors that do only discovery or only classification, or they may do both. But that just means another tool, and much the same as DLP, discovery and classification alone won't protect the data. And for access control, I mentioned before, you might use a cloud access security broker for things in the cloud, or you might adopt identity and access management tools to give you access control as well. But again, that's another tool, another place to make changes to policy. And then there's activity tracing. So you might be looking at UEBA, SIM tools, most have SIM tools, or maybe SOAR tools, or maybe you've even already implemented them. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that through the Fasoo platform, you would get all of this functionality, or to get all this functionality, you would need at least 3 vendors to get discovery, classification, and encryption, access control, and activity tracing. But the Fasoo platform, we can do all of this in a single policy. We have discovery and classification and encryption with the embedded ID, and we have adaptive access control natively out of the box, and tracing and auditing is baked into the platform of Data Radar and DRM. So if I'm to drive anything home, it's going to be this. And as you heard Joe say, how quickly data proliferates, all the approaches that I talked about in the last slide, they really don't do what needs to be done, and that is really to protect the data and protect it first. When you protect the data first, you can eliminate the chasing of data across multiple applications and cloud environments and devices, and ultimately eliminate or reduce alert fatigue. And with that, I will hand it back to Todd for questions. I'm sure that there might be some questions that came through. So Tom, right back to you.
Excellent, Deb. Thanks so much. And Joe, you as well. Indeed, we do have some questions that have come through, and we still have time to take questions. So if you haven't submitted yours yet, do so now. If we can't get to it today, we will make sure that Deb and Joe have these questions and have a chance to respond via email. That said, Joe, I've got a couple of questions for you based on your report. First question is, we've always had unstructured data in our environments, and we've invested significant sums of money to protect all sensitive data. So why is there now a focus on unstructured data?
Well, Tom, the main driver there is that the volume of unstructured data as compared to data in traditional data stores and databases, it's overwhelming. It's orders of magnitude more data than what you could find in those traditional bastions of protection for that data. And like the CISO told me at the bank, he said, he had faith that he was protecting the data, but he was applying controls across the board to everything. And now what you've got is the ability with these new tools and capabilities to really be much more granular and to provide protection to the most sensitive data, and perhaps data that is very generic or garden variety or doesn't have any sensitivity, maybe you can reduce those controls. And if you apply it across the strategy, you might actually be able to save some money and effort, and you might be able to automate some of the processes today to protect that data. So that's why the focus is on the unstructured data, because frankly, we now have the capabilities we didn't have before.
Joe, another question for you. You mentioned, of course, that the U.S. does not currently have a national data privacy law. Do you expect this to change during the Biden administration?
That is a great question. And, you know, I asked that question to every privacy vendor, if you will, every tool vendor that I spoke to. And I think the thought there is it would certainly make life easier for everyone. But being able to do a national level privacy law requires a lot. It requires having to deconflict a lot of different interest groups. Obviously, folks that are concerned about privacy want it to be very stringent. People that are in the business of business obviously want to reduce their cost of compliance. And, you know, we're going to have still the case where laws, because we don't have a complete consensus by one party across you know, the presidency, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, it's still going to be difficult passing anything of that magnitude. I certainly hope it happens. I think that's wishful thinking. We'll just have to see. But I think there'll be a renewed focus on privacy. And as we saw in California in this most recent iteration, they have strengthened their privacy law as well.
Joe, Deborah, here's a question you both can respond to. We use both network and endpoint DLP solutions and have developed a pretty good list of keywords to keep sensitive data from leaving our company. Why do I need something like Data Radar?
Joe, let me take that one first. Yeah. Okay. Anybody that's ever run a DLP before in a larger enterprise, and even in a medium-sized enterprise, that is a real maintenance challenge. I mean, you've got to make sure the keywords are up to date. And even if your keywords are spot on, and even if your DLP tools are fine-tuned, you're still going to get a lot of false positives. So what we learned during our research is that you can use the Fasoo product to make the DLP smarter, to make it more efficient. Or if you haven't invested in DLP, through the step-in approach, you can get these capabilities through Data Radar.
Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. And, you know, if I were to add anything here, I mean, if we look at things like, you know, the privacy regulations like GDPR, for example, mention specific technologies that, you know, are requested to be in place, like encryption, for example. So the neat thing about Data Radar is that it automates encryption, and then, you know, when I say it adds more to it, that's the embedded ID. So you've got the security through encryption, and then you've got the tracing through the ID. So, you know, if you were to look at trying to meet regulations, you know, this is actually protecting the data and giving you the ability to trace it more easily and respond to. You can respond to the auditors or data subject requests much quicker.
Debbie, I've got a question for you as well. The question is, do I need to encrypt files if my DLP stops anything sensitive leaving the company and I monitor any unauthorized file access internally?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. So if we look at DLP, it uses rules to decide if something is sensitive or not. And, you know, most companies need to actually maintain those rules. So people tend to get very clever around getting around these rules. So, you know, people have a job to do, they want to get it done. And, you know, I mentioned all the alerting and blocking and things like that, but with people being a little bit more clever about getting around these rules, next thing you know, you're playing a game of whack-a-mole trying to plug all the holes that people are trying to circumvent. So what you end up getting then is a lot of false positives, and that can actually stop people from legitimately sharing documents. So the other thing is that DLP doesn't prevent things like copying and pasting sensitive content when a file is open. Monitoring authorized file access is usually focused on folders or other document repositories. So if a user copies the file to another location, your location-based security kind of goes away. But by encrypting files and assigning access controls, you always control the file and don't rely on changing rules to prevent unauthorized users from accessing the information. So you don't have to deal with more alerts. I mentioned the alert fatigue, which your IT people can probably tell you that they're already overwhelmed with them in the first place.
Very good. Well, Deborah, Joe, I want to thank you both for your time, for your insight, and for answering these questions today.
Awesome. Thank you. And again, thank you, Joe. Thank you for the ISMG folks, and have a great day.
Yeah, well said. I want to thank our attendees, Deborah, for taking time out of their day to attend this session. I hope that today's discussion provided some valuable new insight from the research and from the analysis to enable you and your organization to be even better prepared to tackle the data security challenges we discussed here today. I look forward to seeing you again in one of our upcoming sessions. Until then, for Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thanks so much for attending today.